I remember the exact shade of the ceiling above me when I woke up. Flat white, too bright, with a hairline crack running across it like something had already broken before I even opened my eyes. The first thing I reached for wasn't the nurse button, it was my phone, because something felt off in a way I couldn't explain. And when the screen finally lit up, there were 12 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and a notification from my bank that didn't make sense at first glance. I blinked through the anesthesia haze and read it again, slower this time, every word landing heavier than the last. Property transfer completed. For a second I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe a delayed notification, maybe some kind of clerical error, because the only property I owned, the only thing I had built entirely on my own, was a $425,000 condo in downtown Seattle that I had spent 8 years paying off, saving for, protecting like it was the only proof I existed in that family. My hands were still weak, my fingers trembling as I tried to unlock the app. But when I finally did, the listing history was already there, archived, finalized, closed, sold. While I was lying unconscious on an operating table, my parents had sold my condo. I didn't feel pain right away, not the kind you expect, no screaming, no crying, just this strange hollow quiet, like my body hadn't caught up to what my brain was trying to process. I stared at the number again, the final sale amount, and then at the account it had been transferred to. It wasn't mine, it was my father's. Robert Carter had always said I wasn't good with big decisions, that I was too emotional to handle assets, words he repeated so often they almost sounded like facts growing up, especially compared to Ashley, my younger sister, who could do no wrong in their eyes. Ashley got the brand new SUV at 21, I got a lecture about budgeting. Ashley got her rent covered in Boston for 3 years, I got told to figure it out like an adult. And somehow despite all of that I still believed there were lines they wouldn't cross. Selling my home while I was in surgery wasn't just crossing a line, it meant they had been planning this, waiting for a moment when I couldn't say no, when I couldn't stop them, when I couldn't even know. One of the voicemails finally autoplayed, my mother's voice, calm, almost rehearsed. "Emily, don't panic when you see the paperwork, we handled everything for you, it was the best decision for the family." The best decision for the family. I almost laughed, except my throat felt too tight to make a sound, because this wasn't the first time they had taken something from me and called it help. It wasn't even the second. There was the savings account they convinced me to temporarily share when I was 23, the credit line they used to cover an emergency that somehow became my responsibility, the endless small moments where what was mine slowly became ours, and then quietly became theirs. But this was different, this was bigger. This was the one thing I had made sure they couldn't touch, or at least, that's what I thought. A nurse stepped into the room, smiling, asking how I was feeling, and I nodded automatically because explaining that my entire life had just been rearranged in the past 48 hours felt impossible to say out loud. Instead, I asked for water for a moment, for anything to buy time while my mind replayed every detail leading up to this surgery. The paperwork I signed, the conversations I had, the way my dad insisted on helping organize my documents the week before, the way my mom kept asking where I kept my keys, my passwords, my files. It was all there, every warning sign I chose to ignore because part of me still wanted to believe they wouldn't go that far. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the realization settle in fully this time, heavier, clearer, undeniable. They hadn't just taken my condo, they had assumed it was everything, and that was their first mistake, because what they didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that the place they sold wasn't the only thing I owned anymore. By the time they discharged me 2 days later, I had already replayed the timeline at least 100 times, every conversation, every small detail that suddenly felt less like coincidence and more like setup. My father insisting on being added as an emergency contact on every document, my mother casually asking for a copy of my property folder just in case, Ashley joking at dinner about how I would probably forget my own passwords if something ever happened to me. It all sounded harmless back then, normal, even the kind of things families say when they pretend to care, but lying in that hospital bed, scrolling through the finalized transaction documents, I could see the pattern clearly for the first time. They did not act out of panic, they acted with precision. I called my father first because I wanted to hear it from him directly, not filtered through polite messages or softened explanations. He answered on the second ring, calm as always, like nothing had changed. "You are awake," he said, not even asking how I felt, not even pretending. I went straight to it, my voice steadier than I expected. "Why is my condo sold?" There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. Then he sighed. Like I was the one being unreasonable. Emily, we talked about this, you needed liquidity, surgery is expensive, and you were not in a position to manage things. I stared out the car window as the nurse pushed my wheelchair toward the exit, the Seattle sky gray and low, matching the weight in my chest. I never agreed to sell, I said, and that was when my mother's voice came in through the speaker, softer but just as controlled. Sweetheart, you were under a lot of stress, you told us to handle it, you probably do not remember. That word, probably, hit harder than anything else because it turned my reality into something optional, something they could rewrite if they said it gently enough. I could picture them in the kitchen, standing side by side like they always did when they needed to present a united front, Ashley somewhere in the background, listening without saying anything because she never had to. Where is the money? I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it out loud. My father did not hesitate this time. It is being used where it matters for the family. For Ashley's situation, you will understand eventually. Ashley's situation, of course, there was always a situation when it came to her. A promotion that required relocation, a relationship that needed support, an opportunity that just could not wait. I closed my eyes for a second, letting that familiar imbalance settle in, the same one I had lived with my entire life, just bigger now, more expensive, harder to ignore. You sold my home while I was unconscious, I said, slower this time, making sure every word landed. We protected your interests, he replied, and I almost admired how easily he said it, how completely he believed it. The car door opened and the nurse helped me inside, asking if someone was picking me up, and I shook my head because I already knew I was on my own. I ended the call without saying goodbye, not out of anger but because there was nothing left to say that would change anything. They had already decided what was mine could become theirs, just like always, only this time they had gone further than they ever had before. As the car pulled away from the hospital, I opened the email folder again, scrolling past the sale confirmation, past the transfer receipts, until I reached the one message I had not opened yet, the one with no subject line, sent to an account I rarely used, an account no one in my family even knew existed. My thumb hovered over it for a second, not because I was afraid, but because I knew once I opened it, there would be no going back to pretending this was just another mistake, another misunderstanding I could smooth over. I tapped the screen and the document loaded slowly, line by line, revealing something I had put in place months ago after a conversation I could not forget, something quiet, legal, and entirely outside of their reach. I leaned back against the seat, the city passing by in a blur, and for the first time since I woke up my breathing steadied, not because the loss hurt less, but because I finally understood the difference between what they thought they had taken and what I had actually secured. They believed they had cornered me, reduced me to nothing, stripped away the one asset that proved I could stand on my own, but they did not know about the second set of keys, the second address, the second name on a document they had never seen. And I did not realize it then, sitting in that car with everything they had done still fresh in my mind, but that assumption, that blind confidence, was about to cost them far more than $425,000. The second set of keys was not in my purse, not in any drawer at my parents' house, and definitely not in any place they could have access during the weeks leading up to my surgery. It was in a safety deposit box downtown, under a name they had never heard me say out loud, tied to an account I opened the same month my grandmother sat across from me at a small cafe on First Avenue, and said something that stayed with me long after she was gone. Emily, the mistake is not trusting people, it is trusting them with everything. At the time I nodded like I understood, but I did not act on it until the pattern became impossible to ignore, until every helpful suggestion from my parents started to sound like quiet control, until every favor came with a shift in ownership that I could not fully explain but always felt. The second property was never meant to be a secret out of spite, it was meant to be a boundary, something entirely mine that existed outside of their reach, a smaller condo. Just outside Bellevue, purchased under a limited liability structure my grandmother's attorney helped me set up, clean, legal, and invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. I had signed the final document 6 months before my surgery, wired the funds myself, and locked every piece of information behind credentials that no one else had access to, not even by accident. And yet, sitting in the back seat of that car, watching the city blur past, I realized something else. Something sharper than the relief of knowing I still had something left. They had not just taken my first condo, they had exposed exactly how far they were willing to go when they believed I could not stop them. That mattered more than the money, because now I knew the ceiling did not exist. They would take whatever they could justify, whenever they could justify it, as long as they believed I would eventually accept it. The email I opened was from the attorney my grandmother introduced me to, a short confirmation that everything we had set up was still secure, still untouched, still entirely under my control, along with a line that felt almost like a quiet echo of her voice. You now have the option to act, not just react. I read that line twice, then a third time, letting it settle in a way nothing else had since I woke up. For years, my role in that family had been reactive, adjusting, accommodating, explaining, absorbing every decision they made as if it were inevitable. But this was different. This time I had information they did not have, assets they could not reach, and time to decide what came next. The driver asked for my address and I gave him the one place I knew I would not be questioned, not judged, not managed. My parents' house, because despite everything I needed to see them, not for closure, not for confrontation in the way they expected, but to understand how far they thought they had. When we pulled into the driveway, Ashley's car was parked in the center spot, brand new, still carrying that polished shine that comes from being recently purchased, and I did not need to ask where the down payment came from. I stepped out slowly, my body still recovering, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. My mother opened the door before I even reached it, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to something rehearsed, concern layered over calculation. "Emily, you should be resting," she said, stepping aside to let me in as if nothing had changed. My father was in the living room, papers spread across the table, the same posture he used whenever he wanted to signal control, stability, authority. He looked up, nodded once and said, "We were going to call you later to explain everything properly." I stood there for a second, taking in the scene, the familiarity of it, the quiet assumption that I would sit down, listen, and eventually agree. Ashley walked in from the kitchen, keys in hand, smiling in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. "You are going to love what we did. It is actually better for you in the long run." Better for me, that phrase had followed me my entire life, attached to decisions I never made and outcomes I never chose. I could feel the old version of myself trying to surface, the one that would ask questions carefully, the one that would try to keep the peace, the one that would accept partial explanations as if they were complete. But that version did not have the full picture. This one did. I took a seat across from my father, folded my hands to keep them steady, and looked at each of them in turn, not with anger, not yet, but with a clarity they had never seen from me before. Because what they thought was the end of the story was actually the moment everything shifted. And I did not realize it then, but walking into that house with something they could not take was the first real advantage I had ever had. I let them talk first because that was what they expected, because in every version of this conversation that had ever happened before, I was the one trying to catch up, trying to understand, trying to justify their decisions in a way that made sense. My father slid a folder across the table toward me, neatly organized, tabs labeled, everything presented like a business transaction instead of a betrayal, and for a moment I almost admired the effort, the way he had turned something deeply personal into something that looked clean and reasonable on paper. "We liquidated the asset at a strong market price," he said, his tone measured, controlled, the same voice he used when explaining investments to clients, "and we reallocated those funds into opportunities that benefit the family as a whole." I did not touch the folder, not yet, because I already knew what was inside: the sale agreement, the transfer confirmation, signatures that should have required me but somehow did not. "You forged my authorization," I said, not raising my voice, just placing the words on the table the way he placed documents, flat and undeniable. My mother shifted slightly, her expression tightening for just a second before smoothing out again. "Emily, that is a very strong word. Everything was handled legally," she said, and there it was again, that careful reframing, turning something wrong into something acceptable by adjusting the language. Ashley leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me like this was some kind of test I was supposed to fail. "You were not exactly available to sign anything, and honestly you would have overcomplicated it," she added, her voice light but edged with that familiar dismissal, like my involvement would have been an inconvenience rather than a right. I nodded slowly, letting them build their version of the story, because every sentence they spoke gave me more clarity, more confirmation of what I already knew. "So you decided for me," I said, and my father did not hesitate. "We made the decision that needed to be made. You will thank us later when you see the bigger picture." The bigger picture, always the bigger picture, always something just out of reach that justified whatever they had already done. I finally opened the folder then, flipping through the pages, not because I needed to read them but because I wanted to see how complete their plan was how confident they had been that I would never question it. The signatures were there, my name replicated in a way that would pass at a glance, the dates aligned perfectly with the day of my surgery, the transfer routed through accounts I recognized all too well. It was thorough, efficient, and entirely built on the assumption that I would not fight back. I closed the folder and placed it back on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, mirroring his precision without even thinking about it. "And Ashley's car," I said, glancing toward the driveway where the new vehicle sat like a quiet confirmation of everything they were not saying directly. My mother smiled then, softer, almost relieved to move the conversation into something she could present as positive. It was time for her to upgrade, and with the funds available it made sense. Of course it did, it always made sense when it came to her. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, not for me but for them, because they were waiting for something, for anger, for confusion, for resistance they could manage and redirect. Instead I gave them something else. "Okay," I said. Simply, that one word landed differently than anything else I could have said, because it did not fit the pattern they knew. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion yet, but in recalibration, trying to understand why I was not pushing back. "Okay?" he repeated, as if testing the word for hidden meaning. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, controlled. "If that is what you believed was best, then I understand." And I could see it then, the shift in the room, the subtle release of tension, the way my mother's shoulders dropped just a fraction, the way Ashley uncrossed her arms, satisfied, the way my father leaned back like a problem had just been resolved. This was the version of me they expected, the one who eventually accepted, who adjusted, who moved on. What they did not see was the difference between acceptance and strategy, between agreement and observation, because while they were settling into the comfort of thinking they had won, I was already mapping out exactly how far they had gone, exactly what they had touched, exactly what they thought they controlled. And I did not realize it then, sitting in that room with everything laid out so neatly in front of me, but saying okay was not the end of the conversation, it was the beginning of something they had never prepared for. I stayed just long enough for the illusion to settle, just long enough for them to believe the situation had been resolved on their terms, and then I stood up slowly, ignoring the slight pull in my side from the surgery, because discomfort was nothing new to me, not in this house, not in this dynamic. My mother followed me toward the door, her voice softer now, almost affectionate. "You should stay a few days, let us take care of you." And for a second, there it was again, that version of reality she preferred, where everything they did could be reframed as care if she said it gently enough. I shook my head, offering a small smile that felt natural enough to pass. "I have somewhere else to be," I said, and that was technically true, just not in the way she would have expected. My father did not stand, did not insist, he simply nodded once, already moving on in his mind, already categorizing this as complete, handled, finished. Ashley gave me a quick glance, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face, curiosity maybe, or maybe just the brief confusion of someone who expected more resistance and did not get it. I stepped outside, the cool air sharper now, clearer, and for the first time since I woke up, I felt something close to control, not because of what I had lost, but because of what I had not shown them. The drive from their house to Bellevue took just under 30 minutes without traffic, a route I had memorized months ago but never once mentioned out loud, not even by accident, not even in passing conversation, because some things only stay yours if they remain invisible. When the car pulled into the underground parking garage, I took a moment before stepping out, letting the quiet settle around me, letting the reality of where I was fully register. This was not a backup plan, not a last resort, this was something I had built deliberately, quietly, piece by piece, without their input, without their influence, without their permission. The elevator ride up felt longer than it was, each floor lighting up one at a time, and when the doors finally opened, I walked down a hallway that still smelled faintly new, clean, untouched by anything that had happened in the past 48 hours. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space simple but intentional. Natural light cutting across the hardwood floors. Furniture minimal but chosen, nothing excessive, nothing borrowed, nothing shared. I set my bag down on the kitchen counter and just stood there for a moment. Not moving, not thinking, just letting the contrast settle in, the difference between a place that was taken and a place that could not be. My phone buzzed once in my hand, a message from my mother. "Let us know when you get home safe." And I stared at it for a second before locking the screen, because answering that would pull me back into their version of events, and I was not stepping back into that. Instead, I walked over to the small desk near the window, opened my laptop, and pulled up the documents I had reviewed earlier, reading them again. Slower this time, not as someone reacting, but as someone preparing. The ownership structure, the registration details, the separation between my personal identity and this asset, all of it designed to do one thing: create a line they could not cross. And yet, what they had done with the first condo meant something important, something I could not ignore. They believed they could act on my behalf without consequence, that they could access, transfer, and benefit from what was mine as long as they justified it as family. That belief was the real problem, not just the loss itself. I leaned back in the chair, the city stretching out beyond the window, and for the first time since everything started, I allowed myself to think beyond the immediate, beyond the shock, beyond the reaction. Because this was no longer about recovering what was lost, it was about redefining what they thought they could take. I did not need to confront them again right away. I did not need to raise my voice or demand anything in that moment. What I needed was time, documentation, and precision. They had shown me exactly how they operated, how they justified, how they moved when they thought I was powerless. And I did not realize it then, sitting in that quiet apartment that existed completely outside their reach, but the fact that they believed I had nothing left was about to become the most expensive assumption they had ever made. The next morning I woke up earlier than I needed to, not because of pain from the surgery but because my mind had already shifted into something sharper, something more structured, and for the first time in a long time I was not reacting to what they had done, I was analyzing it. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open, a legal pad beside me, and I started writing down everything in order, not emotionally, not from memory alone but like a timeline, dates, actions, access points. Every moment that led to the sale of the condo, because details matter when people think they can get away with something. The week before surgery, my father asked for my property documents under the excuse of organizing things in case of emergency. My mother requested copies of my identification for hospital forms that I later confirmed never required them. Ashley casually asked if I had updated my digital signatures because some systems require it now. And at the time I answered without thinking, without connecting any of it. Now it read like preparation, coordinated, intentional. I logged into my accounts again, double-checking access logs, confirming what I already suspected, that the authorization did not come from me, not directly but through credentials. They had gathered piece by piece over time. It was not one big breach, it was a series of small permissions I had given without realizing the cumulative risk. That realization did not make me angry. Not in the way they would expect, it made me precise. I opened a separate document and began outlining what I needed, not to argue with them, not to confront them emotionally, but to establish control over the narrative in a way they could not dismiss. Documentation of ownership, proof of unauthorized transfer, timeline of incapacity during surgery, access records, and most importantly, separation between what they believed they had control over and what they actually did. My phone buzzed again, another message from my mother. "We should talk later, there are things you need to understand." And I let it sit there, unread, because understanding was never the issue, control was. I reached out to the attorney my grandmother had introduced me to, not with panic, not with urgency, but with a simple message: I need to review a transaction executed during a period of medical incapacity. And within 20 minutes I had a response asking for the documents, not questioning, not doubting, just moving forward. That difference alone told me everything about the kind of conversation I was about to have. One based on facts, not family roles. I attached the files, every page my father had placed so neatly in that folder, and hit send. Then I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city again, letting the stillness settle in, because what came next would not be immediate. It would not be loud, and it would not look like the kind of conflict they were used to managing. This would be structured, layered, and timed. A few hours later my phone rang, the attorney's name on the screen, and I answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that does not react but evaluates. "Emily, I have reviewed the initial documents, and there are several points we need to discuss." I sat back down, pen in hand, ready to take notes, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted every step documented. "The authorization appears to have been executed without direct consent during a period where your medical status could be considered impaired," he continued, "which introduces serious questions about validity." I did not interrupt, I did not react, I just listened, because this was the first time since everything happened that someone was describing the situation without rewriting it to fit a narrative. Additionally, he added, the transfer of funds into a third-party account, particularly a family member, without explicit authorization may expose them to liability. Liability, not misunderstanding, not family decision, not protection but liability. That word settled differently, heavier, more permanent. I thanked him, asked the questions I needed to ask, and ended the call with something I had not felt in a long time, not relief, not satisfaction but clarity. I closed my laptop slowly, letting the silence return, because now the situation had shifted from something personal to something defined, something measurable, something they could not explain away with tone or intention. They believed they had made a decision for me, that they had closed a chapter, that I would eventually accept it the way I always had before. But what they did not know, what they could not see from where they were standing, was that the moment they acted without my consent was the moment they stepped into something they could not control, and I did not realize it then, but everything I was putting together in that quiet apartment was not just preparation. It was the beginning of a reversal they had never considered possible. By the third day, the silence from my side had already started to do something I expected but did not rush. It created space for them to fill with their own assumptions. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my mother, 1 from Ashley, and a short message from my father that simply read, "We need to finalize a few remaining details," and I could almost hear the tone behind it, controlled, slightly impatient, the same tone he used whenever he believed something was already decided and I was just a step behind. I did not respond right away, not because I was avoiding them, but because timing mattered. Now more than anything else. Instead, I focused on the documents the attorney had requested, pulling bank records, access logs, and email confirmations, organizing everything in a way that told a clear story without needing explanation. Every action they took was now a line item, every assumption they made was now a point of exposure. I noticed something else as I reviewed the transfer records more closely, something small but important. The account my father used to receive the funds was not just a personal account, it was tied to a business entity he managed, which meant the transaction was not just private, it was structured, documented, and therefore traceable in a way he might not have fully considered. That detail alone shifted the situation further, because it moved the conversation from family disagreement into something that involved accountability at a level he respected but rarely expected to be applied to himself. Around noon my phone rang again, this time Ashley, and, after a brief pause I answered. Her voice was lighter than usual, almost casual. "Are you seriously not going to say anything about all this?" she asked, and I could hear it underneath, not concern, not even frustration but curiosity, like she was trying to understand why the reaction she expected had not happened yet. "What do you want me to say?" I replied, keeping my tone even, controlled. There was a short laugh on the other end. "I do not know, maybe something about how we helped you avoid a financial mess." And there it was again, the narrative already formed, already rehearsed. I leaned back in the chair, looking out at the skyline, letting her fill the silence for a second longer before I spoke. "You think selling something that was not yours is helping?" The line went quiet for a moment, not long but enough to shift the rhythm. "It was not just yours," she said finally, and that sentence told me everything I needed to know about how they justified it internally. Ownership to them was flexible, conditional, something that adjusted based on who needed it more, or at least who they decided needed it more. "That is interesting," I said, not arguing, not correcting, just acknowledging. "Why?" she asked, and I could hear the edge now, the slight irritation of not being able to predict where the conversation was going. "Because that is not how ownership works," I replied, simple, direct, and then I let the silence return. She did not push further, did not escalate, she just said, "You are overthinking this," and ended the call. Overthinking, another familiar label, one they used whenever I got too close to something they did not want examined. I set the phone down and looked back at the documents in front of me, the clean lines of evidence, the clarity of what had actually happened compared to what they believed had happened. They thought this was a closed situation, something already resolved, something I would eventually adapt to the way I always had before. But what they did not see was that every hour they spent believing that gave me more time to build something they could not undo. Later that afternoon, the attorney called again, his voice steady, precise. "Emily, based on what you have provided, we can begin outlining next steps, but I need to ask, what is your objective here?" And that question mattered, not legally but strategically. I did not answer immediately because for the first time I had options that were not reactive, not limited to damage control. I could challenge the transaction, I could pursue recovery, I could expose the process they used, or I could do something else entirely. I looked around the apartment at the space they did not know existed, at the life they thought they had reduced, and I realized something important. This was not just about getting back what they took, it was about redefining what they believed they could take from me going forward. I want to understand exactly how far this goes, I said finally, and there was a brief pause on the other end before he responded. Then we proceed carefully, and that was exactly what I intended to do, because they were still operating under the assumption that I had lost everything, that I was limited, that I was cornered into accepting their version of events, and I did not realize it then, but the longer they held on to that belief, the more exposed they were becoming to a reality they had not prepared for. The following day did not feel different on the surface, the same light coming through the windows, the same quiet hum of the city below, but internally something had shifted into a steady rhythm, not emotional, not reactive, just focused. I spent the morning reviewing the compiled timeline again, refining it, removing anything unnecessary, making sure every point connected cleanly to the next, because if there was one thing I had learned from watching my father operate over the years, it was that control came from clarity and clarity came from structure. Every time he had ever dismissed me, it was because I approached things emotionally, because I reacted instead of presenting something undeniable, and this time I was not giving him that option. Around mid-morning, my attorney sent over a preliminary breakdown of potential actions, not conclusions, just pathways, each one outlined with what it required and what it could lead to. I read through them slowly, not rushing, because this was not about choosing the fastest response, it was about choosing the most effective one. One option focused on immediate reversal of the transaction, challenging the validity based on medical incapacity, another focused on financial recovery through improper transfer of funds, and a third, more complex, addressed the broader pattern of access and control they had exercised over time. That third option caught my attention not because it was aggressive but because it acknowledged something deeper than just this one event. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from my father, shorter than usual. We need your confirmation on a few outstanding items related to the sale, and I read it twice, not because I did not understand but because of what it implied. He was still moving forward, still operating under the assumption that my role in this was procedural, that I would confirm, finalize, close. I did not respond. Instead, I opened the sale documents again, focusing on the details I had not fully examined before. And that was when I noticed it, a clause near the end of the agreement referencing additional liabilities tied to the property, minor on its own but significant in context. If they had transferred ownership under those conditions without proper authorization, then they had not just taken something from me, they had potentially taken on something they did not fully understand. I leaned back in my chair, letting that thought settle because it changed the dynamic in a way they had not anticipated. They believed they had extracted value, but they may have also absorbed risk. And the fact that they did not question that, did not investigate it fully, meant they were still operating with the same confidence that had always protected them from consequences. By early afternoon, my attorney called again, his tone slightly more direct this time. Emily, there is another layer here you should be aware of. I listened carefully as he explained how certain elements of the transaction, if challenged, could trigger a broader review of associated accounts and entities, especially if there was evidence of unauthorized access or misrepresentation. This is not just about the property anymore, he said, and I could hear the implication clearly. This could extend beyond what they thought they controlled. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat in silence for a moment, not overwhelmed, not hesitant, just aware of the scale of what was now in front of me. This was no longer a single decision point, it was a network of consequences that could unfold depending on how I chose to proceed. I picked up my phone and finally responded to my father, keeping it simple. I will review everything and get back to you. Nothing more, nothing less. I knew how that would read on his end, compliance process, cooperation, and that was exactly what I needed him to believe, because the moment he sensed resistance, he would shift, adjust, try to regain control in ways that would complicate everything. But if he believed I was still following his structure, still operating within his expectations, then he would continue exactly as he was, confident, predictable, exposed. I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out over the skyline again, the same view that had grounded me the day before, but now it felt different, not because anything had changed outside, but because I understood something I had never fully accepted before. Control was not about reacting to what they did, it was about allowing them to reveal everything they were willing to do. And I did not realize it then, but every message they sent, every assumption they made, every step they took thinking I was still catching up was building a case they would not be able to step away from once it was complete. That evening, I received something I had been expecting but not rushing, a formal email forwarded from my father, subject line clean and professional, final confirmation required. with attachments I had already seen but now positioned as the last step in what he believed was a completed process. I opened it slowly, not because I needed time to understand, but because I wanted to see how far he would go in maintaining the structure he had built, how confidently he would continue moving forward. As if nothing had shifted, the message itself was concise, outlining the sale, the distribution of funds, and a request for my acknowledgement to close out remaining administrative items, and I could almost picture him typing it, deliberate, controlled, expecting compliance. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I forwarded the entire thread to my attorney with a single line: "Please review the requested confirmation." And within minutes, I had a reply, not emotional, not reactive, just clear. "Do not sign or acknowledge anything at this stage." I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle, because this was the first direct instruction that defined what I already knew, that every move now mattered not just for what it did, but for what it allowed them to claim later. My phone buzzed again, this time a group message, my mother and Ashley included, something that rarely happened unless they wanted to present unity. "We are all on the same page here, Emily, this is just a formality," my mother wrote, followed by Ashley adding, "Seriously, you are making this more complicated than it needs to be." And there it was again, the pattern: minimize, simplify, push forward, close the gap before I could step outside of it. I stared at the screen for a moment, not feeling the need to respond, because every message they sent was doing something they did not realize. It was documenting their assumptions, their pressure, their belief that I was still operating within their framework. Instead of replying, I opened my notes again, adding timestamps, saving screenshots, building a record not of what they said, but of how they said it, the tone, the timing, the sequence. Because this was no longer about convincing them they were wrong, it was about showing, if necessary, that they never questioned whether they were right. Later that night, my attorney called again, his tone steady but more focused. "Emily, based on the additional communication, I recommend we begin preparing a formal notice, not to escalate immediately, but to establish position." I listened carefully, pen in hand, writing down each point, because this was the shift from observation to action. "This will not be aggressive," he continued, "but it will clearly outline that the transaction is disputed and that no further action should be taken without your explicit consent." I nodded, even though he could not see me, because that was exactly the balance I needed, not confrontation but definition. After the call, I sat in silence again, the apartment quiet except for the faint sound of traffic below, and I realized something that had not fully formed until that moment. They were not just assuming control over my assets. They were assuming control over my response, expecting me to follow a pattern they had relied on for years: confusion first, then frustration, then eventual acceptance. But what they did not account for was what happens when that pattern breaks, when the response does not follow the script they understand. I picked up my phone and typed a single message back to the group, not long, not detailed, just enough to keep the structure intact. "I am still reviewing everything." And I sent it without hesitation. I knew exactly how that would land: delay, process, compliance in motion, and that was what I needed them to believe for just a little longer, because the moment they realized I was not moving toward agreement, they would adjust, and right now their consistency was my advantage. I stood up and walked to the window again, the city lights reflecting faintly against the glass, and I allowed myself one moment of clarity, not about what I had lost, but about what they had exposed. Every assumption they made, every step they took, every message they sent thinking I was still catching up was reinforcing something they could not take back. And I did not realize it then, but by the time they understood that I was no longer part of their process, it would already be too late for them to rewrite what had already been set in motion. The next step did not happen all at once. It unfolded in layers, quiet and controlled, exactly the way I needed it to, because by the time my father sent another follow-up email the next morning, slightly more direct, slightly less patient, I already knew what was about to shift. "Emily, we cannot keep delaying this, there are deadlines involved," he wrote, and that word, deadlines, told me he was feeling pressure somewhere in the process, something time-sensitive that he needed me to complete, to finalize whatever structure he had set in motion. I read the message twice, not reacting, just noting the change in tone, because for the first time since everything started, he was not entirely in control of the timeline. I forwarded the email to my attorney, and within the hour, I received a draft of the formal notice he had mentioned, clean, precise, and unmistakably clear in its intent. It outlined the dispute of the transaction, referenced the timing of my surgery, the absence of direct authorization, and most importantly, it established that any further actions related to the property or funds were to be halted immediately pending review. It did not accuse, it did not escalate emotionally, It simply defined a boundary in terms my father could not ignore or reinterpret. I read through it slowly, adjusting nothing, because there was nothing to adjust. Every word was placed exactly where it needed to be. When I approved it, I did not feel nervous. I did not hesitate, because this was not a reaction. It was a response that had been building since the moment I woke up in that hospital room. The notice was sent mid-morning, and the response did not come right away, which told me something had shifted on their side as well. Silence from my father was never accidental. It meant he was recalculating, reassessing, trying to understand where the structure he built no longer held. Around noon my phone rang, his name on the screen, and I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation but out of control. His voice was different this time, still measured but with a sharp edge underneath. "Emily, I just received something from your attorney," he said. And there it was, the moment where his version of events met something he could not reframe. "Yes," I replied simply, not offering anything more. There was a brief pause, longer than any he had allowed before, and then he continued, "This is unnecessary, we handled everything appropriately." The same line, the same confidence, but it did not land the same anymore, not after it had been placed in a context he could not control. "That is not what the notice says," I replied, keeping my tone even because tone was no longer the tool he could use against me. Another pause, this one tighter, more controlled. "You are escalating this into something it does not need to be," he said, and I could hear it now, not just control but resistance, the first sign that his assumptions were being challenged in a way he could not easily manage. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the skyline, letting the silence stretch just enough before I answered. "I am defining what it is." And that was the difference, not escalation, not conflict, but definition. He did not respond immediately, and for a second I could almost feel the shift on the other end of the line, the realization that the pattern he relied on was no longer there, that I was not moving toward acceptance, not adjusting to his version of events. "We will discuss this in person," he said finally, and before I could respond the call ended. I lowered the phone slowly, not surprised because that was the next move. Bring it back into a setting he understood, a conversation he could control, a space where tone and presence could shift the balance again. But what he did not realize was that the structure had already changed, that the conversation was no longer the center of this, the documentation was. I turned back to my laptop, reviewing the notice again, the language firm, the boundaries clear, and for the first time since everything began I could see the full shape of what was unfolding. They believed this was still something they could manage through conversation, through pressure, through familiarity, but that assumption was already outdated. And I did not realize it then, but the moment that notice reached him was the moment the situation stopped being something they controlled and became something they had to respond to, and that shift was not something they had ever prepared for. The meeting did not happen immediately, which told me more than anything my father could have said directly, because when he wanted control, he moved quickly, decisively on his terms, but now there was a delay, a recalibration happening behind the scenes that I could not see but could clearly feel. 2 days passed with no direct call from him, only a short message from my mother asking if I was sure this was necessary, and another from Ashley that simply read, "You are overreacting." Both predictable, both attempts to pull me back into a version of the situation where emotion could replace structure. I did not respond to either. Instead, I focused on the updates coming from my attorney, each one building on the last, each one adding another layer of clarity to what had already been set in motion. By the third day, we had a formal response from their side, not from my father directly, but from a legal representative tied to his business entity, and that alone confirmed what I had already suspected. He was no longer treating this as a private matter. He was protecting himself within a framework he understood, one that relied on process rather than persuasion. I opened the document slowly, reading each line carefully, noting the language, the positioning, the way they attempted to justify the transaction as being conducted in good faith, and in the best interest of the owner. Phrases that sounded solid until placed against the timeline we had already established. What stood out more than anything was what they did not address directly, the lack of explicit authorization, the timing during my medical procedure, the transfer into an account that benefited them personally. It was not a denial, it was a deflection, and that told me everything I needed to know about where they stood. My phone rang shortly after, my father's name appearing again, and this time I answered without hesitation. His voice was different, still controlled, but now measured in a way that suggested he was choosing every word more carefully than before. "Emily, we need to resolve this," he said, and for the first time, the word resolve did not sound like closure, it sounded like negotiation. That is what I am doing, I replied, keeping my tone steady because tone was no longer the variable in this equation. There was a pause, then he continued. This has gone further than it needed to, and I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed exactly what had shifted. This was no longer contained within his expectations. It went as far as your decision took it, I said, and I let that sit there, not pushing, not adding, just placing the responsibility where it had always been. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, the certainty that had defined every previous conversation was no longer as sharp. What do you want? He asked. And that question mattered more than anything else he had said so far, because it acknowledged something he had not acknowledged before, that I was no longer reacting, I was determining. I leaned back slightly, looking out over the city again, letting the silence stretch just enough before answering, because the answer itself was not complicated, but the weight behind it was. I want this defined correctly, I said, not listing demands, not outlining terms, just stating the core of what this had become. He did not respond immediately, and in that silence I could feel the shift settle fully, the realization that this was no longer something he could frame or redirect through familiarity. We can discuss terms, he said finally, and there it was, the language had changed from decision to discussion, from control to negotiation. I ended the call shortly after, not because there was nothing more to say, but because everything that needed to change had already changed. I placed the phone down on the table and looked at the documents in front of me again, the timeline, the notice, the responses, all of it forming a structure that did not rely on anyone's interpretation, not even mine. They had acted with certainty, with confidence, with the belief that I would remain within the role they had always assigned me. But now that role no longer existed. And I did not realize it then, but the moment my father asked what I wanted was the moment the entire balance shifted, because from that point forward, every step they took would no longer be based on assumption, it would be based on response, and that was something they had never had to do before. The next conversation was not held in a living room or over a phone call. It was scheduled, structured, and defined before it even began. A conference call with my attorney on one side and my father's legal representative on the other, with my father present but noticeably quieter than he had ever been in any previous discussion we had. I joined from the same seat by the window, the city stretching out in front of me, but this time I was not looking for clarity. I already had it, I was there to confirm what had already been set in motion. The call began with formalities, names, acknowledgments, the kind of introductions that strip away familiarity and replace it with roles, and for the first time my father was not speaking as my father, he was positioned as a party in a dispute. His attorney led the conversation, outlining their position, reiterating that the transaction had been conducted with what they described as reasonable authority and family-based discretion, phrases that sounded composed but lacked the one element that now mattered more than anything else, my explicit consent. My attorney responded calmly, not raising his voice, not challenging emotionally, but placing each point back into the framework we had built, the timing of the surgery, the lack of direct authorization, the transfer of funds into an account that directly benefited them. And as each point was stated, I could feel the shift deepen, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. This was no longer about interpretation, it was about definition. At one point my father spoke, breaking his silence in a way that felt more measured than before. We acted in what we believed was her best interest. And for a moment that sentence hung there, familiar, almost expected, but now it landed differently because belief was no longer the standard being applied. My attorney did not respond immediately, allowing that statement to sit before addressing it directly. Intent does not replace authorization, he said, and that single line did more than any argument could have. It removed the foundation my father had relied on for years, the idea that intention could justify action. There was a pause after that, longer than any before, and in that silence I could feel something shift completely, not just in the conversation, but in how this entire situation was being understood. They were no longer explaining, they were adjusting. Terms began to change, language softened, references to resolution and correction started to appear, and for the first time, the possibility of reversing or compensating for the transaction was mentioned directly. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, because this was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for precision. When my attorney asked if I wanted to respond, I took a second, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted the weight of what I said to be clear. I want everything accounted for, I said, not raising my voice, not adding anything unnecessary, just defining the scope. There was no immediate pushback to that, no attempt to minimize it, because by that point, the structure had already shifted too far for them to return to their original position. The conversation moved into specifics after that, timelines for document review, potential adjustments, steps that would need to be taken to address what had already been done, and through all of it, my father remained quieter than I had ever known him to be, speaking only when necessary, choosing his words carefully in a way that reflected something I had not seen before. Not control but caution. When the call ended, it did not feel like a victory, not in the way people imagine. There was no sense of triumph, no immediate resolution, just a clear understanding that the situation had moved into a space they could not control the way they once had. I closed my laptop slowly, letting the silence return to the apartment, and for a moment I thought back to the hospital room, to the notification on my phone, to the realization that everything I thought I had could be taken without me even knowing. And then I looked around the space I was in now, the one they did not know about, the one they could not reach, and I understood something fully for the first time. This was never just about one property, one decision, one moment of betrayal. It was about a pattern that had finally reached a point where it could not continue without consequence. And I did not realize it then, but what had started as a loss had already become something else entirely, something that would not just correct what they had done, but redefine what they could ever do again. The resolution did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a single decisive moment. It came in a series of documents, revisions, and confirmations that quietly reassembled what had been taken and redefined what could never be taken again. Over the next 2 weeks, every piece of the transaction was reviewed, challenged, and corrected, not through argument, not through emotion, but through structure that could not be ignored or rewritten. The sale itself was not simply undone in the way I had first imagined, because by that point it had moved through too many stages, but the value, the control, and the consequences were reallocated in a way that reflected what should have been there from the beginning: my authorization, my ownership, my decision. The funds that had been transferred into my father's account were traced, accounted for, and ultimately redirected back under my control, not as a favor, not as a concession, but as a correction that could not be avoided once the full scope of the situation was defined. Additional adjustments followed. Liabilities that had been overlooked were addressed, obligations that had been assumed without understanding were reassigned, and through all of it, the tone from their side continued to shift, from certainty to caution, from control to compliance. I did not attend any of the in-person follow-up meetings. I did not need to, because everything that mattered was already documented, already structured in a way that did not require my presence to hold its weight. My father spoke less with each update, his responses shorter, more precise, no longer framed as decisions but as acknowledgments of what had to be done. My mother's messages became infrequent, softer, less certain, and Ashley, for the first time I could remember, stopped inserting herself into the situation entirely. When the final set of documents arrived, confirming that the financial and legal position had been corrected, I read through them once, then again, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to understand exactly what had changed. The answer was simple and more significant than I expected. Everything was now defined in a way that did not rely on assumption, not theirs, not mine. The boundaries were clear, the ownership was explicit, and the access they once moved through without question was now restricted in ways they could not bypass. I signed what needed to be signed, not as a reaction, not as acceptance, but as confirmation of something that had already been established. When it was done, there was no celebration, no sense of victory in the way people imagine, just a quiet, steady understanding that something fundamental had shifted permanently. A few days later, my father called again, not about the documents, not about the process, but simply to ask if we could talk, his voice measured, careful in a way I had never heard before. I listened, but I did not rush to respond because for the first time, the timing of that conversation was not his to decide. I ended the call without committing to anything, not out of distance, but out of clarity. I walked across the apartment, past the window, past the desk where everything had been built piece by piece, and I stopped by the counter where my keys rested, 2 sets, one for the place they thought defined everything, and one for the place they never knew existed. I picked up the second set, the one tied to a decision I made quietly months ago, and I held it for a moment, not as a reminder of what I had protected, but of what I had learned. Because this was never just about property, or money, or a single decision made while I was unable to respond. It was about a pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long, a system where my role had always been assumed rather than defined. and now that system no longer existed in the same way. They could not access what was mine without permission, they could not redefine my decisions without consequence, and most importantly, they could not assume I would remain silent within it. I set the keys back down, the sound small but final, and, for the first time since everything began, I allowed myself to step away from the process completely, not because it was unresolved, but because it no longer required me to stay inside it. And I did not realize it then, but the most important part of what happened was not what I regained, it was what they lost, the certainty that they could decide for me and never be challenged because that certainty was never coming back.